This is Democratic Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas. Senator, you were with the President yesterday on his trip to Texas. You're now back in Washington to visit the White House now and pay your final respects. I suppose it's been a trying experience for you, sir.
Yes, Mr. Mudd, it has been a trying experience. I served on the Labor Committee with John F. Kennedy for 3 years. I thought he was one of the most brilliant men that I've ever known, if not the most brilliant man that I've ever known. I majored in history before I got into law. I've witnessed some history. I had hoped that I would never be a witness to such a tragic event in the history of this nation. This was a tragedy unspeakable.
Senator, do you have fear now that 24 hours have passed that Texas and Dallas will be held in contempt by your fellow Americans?
Well, there might be some danger of that, but I think that will wear away in the light of history as the people see what happened. I have been in a number of parades with presidential candidates in Texas, with presidents, governors, vice presidents, and with some of the astronauts. The welcome in Dallas yesterday was the warmest welcome I've ever seen anyone receive in Dallas. There were something like 300,000 people on the streets. When President Kennedy came to Dallas as a candidate, he and Speaker Rayburn and Vice President Johnson in 1960, the crowd was maybe a third this large. And this was a warm, friendly crowd. Very few signs of an opposition party along the street. People waved. It's the most friendly greeting that I've ever seen anyone receive in Dallas. It's really more friendly than the greetings in 2 of the other Texas cities. And the people had looked to me like the whole city was bent on showing that that was a warm-hearted, friendly city. And to have this, it's a tragedy not only to the whole nation, it's a tragedy to that great city and a tragedy to the state of Texas, that whatever wild assassin murdered our president, that he picked that spot in that city and that building to do it in.
Would you, Senator, look forward now to the presidency of our new chief executive, Lyndon Johnson? How do you think the country will respond to him?
Well, while Speaker Rayburn was Speaker and Vice President and now President Johnson was Majority Leader, the assistants to each were Mike Mansfield in the Senate and the present Speaker McCormick of Massachusetts in the House. And those 4 worked together as a team for years. Rayburn and McCormick in the House and Johnson and Mansfield in the Senate. And President Johnson will have worked with these leaders more perhaps than any other president in modern history has ever worked closely with the leaders of both houses. So I think he will have an extremely successful legislative history in his relationships with the Congress. He has worked so long with the leaders up here before he was elevated to the vice presidency. And there was one thing, President Kennedy and President Johnson were dissimilar in some respects in that President Kennedy was more of, you might say, a medieval type man, not in his governmental attitudes, extremely forward-looking, but a patron of the arts and a patron of literature and a patron of education and many things, while President Johnson is more of a Westerner and full of action. But there was one thing that's, as I've thought about him, that a characteristic of these 2 men. Both are bold men, both President Kennedy and President Johnson. Both are men of action. Both took chances. President Johnson gave up a sure seat in the House to run for the Senate in a race that everybody said he couldn't possibly win. And he started off, I think, within the polls with 26% of the people for him and won that race for the Senate in a hard, grueling campaign of 2 primaries. So if you go to the background on the main thing, each were men of firm decision, each were bold men, each were men of action. Neither sat down and took a passive attitude about politics or government and just waited for the main chance to come along. Each went out and made those chances. That's the kind of dynamic drive we need in the presidency. We've had that great leadership under President Kennedy. I predict bold, dynamic action under President Johnson also, because that's the way, if President Kennedy got to the presidency, that's the way Vice President Johnson came to the vice presidency. And I think, Mr. Mudd, you as an experienced newsman and an experienced historian, if you think these over, you will see running through the thread of their lives this common characteristic of those 2 men: boldness in execution, quick in decision, and bold in decision, and then strong in the execution of those bold decisions they reach.